There are people who leave you feeling strangely exhausted, not because they shouted at you, not because they attacked you, but because after every conversation, you feel as though something inside you has quietly disappeared. Your energy fades, your confidence weakens, your thoughts become clouded, and although nothing visible has happened, you somehow leave feeling smaller than when you arrived. Most people dismiss this experience. They call it stress, bad luck, an awkward conversation, or simply a difficult personality. But the unconscious understands something the conscious mind often ignores. Not every battle is fought with words. Some are fought with attention, some with emotion, and some with the invisible exchange of psychological energy. Long before modern psychology attempted to explain these experiences, ancient civilizations understood that human beings constantly influence one another in ways that cannot always be measured. A room can feel heavy before anyone speaks. One person's presence can inspire courage, another's can quietly awaken fear, without realizing it. The human psyche is continuously communicating beneath language. When I began exploring the unconscious, I noticed something remarkable. Certain individuals seemed incapable of producing their own psychological stability. Instead, they unconsciously searched for it within others. They sought admiration, attention, validation, control, conflict, not because they were evil, but because something inside them remained profoundly incomplete. An empty vessel naturally seeks to be filled. An unconscious soul does the same. This is why some people seem strangely drawn toward individuals who possess clarity, purpose, compassion, or quiet confidence. Light attracts what darkness cannot create for itself. Yet there is something important you must understand. When I speak of darkness, I do not mean evil. I speak of unconsciousness. Darkness is simply that which has not yet become conscious. Every human being carries both light and shadow, both love and fear, both wisdom and ignorance. The difference lies in whether we recognize these forces or allow them to govern us without awareness. Many people imagine psychological energy as something mystical. In reality, you experience it every day. Consider how different you feel after spending several hours with someone who genuinely understands you. You feel lighter, more alive, your thoughts become clearer, your breathing relaxes, your creativity awakens. Now compare that with spending an hour with someone who constantly criticizes, complains, competes, or quietly manipulates every conversation toward themselves. Nothing physical has changed, yet your body feels tired. Your enthusiasm disappears, even your posture begins to change. Why? Because the unconscious is always responding to emotional environments. Human beings are remarkably contagious, not only through behavior, but through emotional states. Fear spreads, confidence spreads, bitterness spreads, hope spreads, anxiety spreads, peace spreads. Without speaking a single word, people continuously shape one another's inner worlds. The greatest mistake most people make is believing this influence only exists on the surface. It does not. The unconscious constantly absorbs patterns from everyone around you. You become like the conversations you repeatedly entertain, like the emotions you repeatedly tolerate, like the environments you repeatedly inhabit. This is why protecting your psychological world is not selfish, it is necessary. Imagine planting the healthiest tree in poisoned soil. No matter how strong its roots, the environment slowly weakens it. Likewise, even a courageous soul can gradually lose its vitality if constantly surrounded by unconscious minds. Many individuals spend years wondering why they no longer recognize themselves. They once possessed ambition, curiosity, joy. They dreamed boldly, loved deeply, created fearlessly. Now, everything feels heavy. Motivation disappears. Simple decisions become exhausting. They blame age, responsibility, circumstances. Rarely do they ask the deeper question: who have I been allowing into my psychological world? This question changes everything, because every relationship becomes an exchange, not merely of words, but of emotional energy. Observe two candles placed beside one another. One burns brightly, the other barely survives. If the weaker candle never learns to create its own flame, it constantly depends upon another source. Many relationships unconsciously function this way. One person continuously gives, the other continuously receives. One listens, the other endlessly speaks. One encourages, the other constantly complains. One forgives, the other repeatedly wounds. Eventually, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. The tragedy is that generous people often mistake emotional exhaustion for kindness. They believe constantly sacrificing themselves proves love. But love without awareness eventually becomes self-abandonment. You cannot endlessly pour from an empty vessel. Eventually, compassion becomes resentment, patience becomes fatigue, kindness becomes obligation. The unconscious quietly whispers, something is no longer balanced. Few people listen. Instead, they work harder, please more people, smile more often, ignore their intuition, and each time they ignore that inner voice, they move further away from themselves. One of the greatest discoveries I made was that the psyche constantly communicates through discomfort, anxiety, restlessness, emotional fatigue, persistent irritation. These experiences often carry messages, yet modern life teaches us to silence every message immediately. We distract ourselves, we scroll endlessly, we consume more information, more entertainment, more noise, anything to avoid listening. But silence reveals truths distraction can never hide. The soul grows quiet before it grows weak. Pay attention to the people who always require your attention, yet rarely ask about your heart. Notice those who celebrate your failures more enthusiastically than your successes. Observe those who become strangely uncomfortable whenever your confidence increases. These patterns rarely appear overnight. They reveal themselves slowly, like cracks forming beneath the surface of stone. At first, you dismiss them. You explain them away, you convince yourself you are imagining things, but your unconscious notices everything. Long before your conscious mind understands, your psyche has already sensed the imbalance. This is why intuition often arrives before logic. The unconscious processes infinitely more information than consciousness ever realizes. It notices subtle expressions, changes in tone, hidden resentment, artificial praise, quiet envy. The conscious mind seeks evidence. The unconscious recognizes patterns. And yet, most people have been taught to distrust this inner intelligence. They ignore it until emotional exhaustion finally forces them to pay attention. Then they wonder why life suddenly feels overwhelming. It did not happen suddenly. It happened gradually, one unnoticed interaction at a time, one ignored feeling at a time, one compromised boundary at a time, one abandoned truth at a time. Eventually, the soul begins whispering what the ego refuses to hear. You are giving away too much of yourself. Many confuse love with limitless availability, but genuine love does not require the destruction of the self. True compassion includes wisdom. It knows when to help, and when helping only strengthens another person's unconscious dependence. Some people do not seek healing. They seek someone willing to carry the weight they refuse to confront. If you continuously carry another person's unconscious burdens, you eventually forget how to carry your own dreams. This is why individuation, the journey toward becoming your authentic self, requires courage. Not merely the courage to face your own shadow, but the courage to stop living as fuel for someone else's unconscious life. Because every moment you deny your own truth to preserve another person's comfort, a small part of your light quietly disappears. And if this continues long enough, you begin searching for the very light you once carried naturally within yourself. There is a truth about human nature that few people are willing to confront. Not everyone who enters your life comes to grow with you. Some arrive because they sense something within you that they themselves cannot find. It is not always intentional. It is rarely conscious. But the unconscious possesses an extraordinary instinct for seeking what it lacks. A lonely person searches for certainty. An insecure person searches for confidence. Someone disconnected from their purpose searches for those who possess direction. This by itself is not unhealthy. Every human being learns from others. We inspire one another. We strengthen one another. We borrow courage until we discover our own. The problem begins when learning quietly transforms into dependence, when admiration slowly becomes possession, when appreciation becomes expectation, and when connection becomes consumption. This transformation rarely happens overnight. It begins so subtly that most people never recognize it. At first, they simply enjoy your company. Then, they begin depending upon your reassurance. Soon, every decision requires your approval. Every emotional crisis becomes your responsibility. Every disappointment somehow finds its way onto your shoulders. Without realizing it, you slowly become responsible for carrying a life that was never yours to carry. This is one of the greatest dangers facing compassionate people, because compassion naturally wishes to reduce suffering. It wants to help, to comfort, to understand, to heal. Yet compassion without consciousness eventually becomes captivity. You begin living for everyone except yourself, and strangely, the more you sacrifice, the less appreciated you often become. Why? Because unconscious dependence always grows hungry. It never says, "This is enough." Instead, it whispers, "Just a little more. A little more time, a little more attention, a little more forgiveness, a little more energy," until eventually there is almost nothing left of you. This is why I often reminded my patients that what remains unconscious never becomes satisfied. The unconscious does not understand moderation. It seeks repetition. If someone unconsciously depends upon your emotional strength, they will continue seeking it until awareness interrupts the pattern. Unfortunately, most people mistake this dependence for love. They believe being needed means being valued. These are not the same thing. A child needs a parent. That is natural. But two psychologically mature adults should not depend upon one another for identity. Healthy love encourages growth. Unhealthy attachment fears it. Notice what happens when you begin changing. Perhaps you become calmer, more confident, less reactive. You establish healthier boundaries. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop explaining every decision. You stop seeking approval. Suddenly, certain people become uncomfortable not because you have harmed them, but because your transformation silently exposes their unwillingness to transform themselves. Your growth becomes a mirror, and mirrors can be frightening, especially to those who have spent years avoiding their own reflection. This is why some individuals criticize you the moment you begin becoming your authentic self. They say, "You've changed. You're selfish now. You think you're better than everyone." But often, what truly disturbs them is not your behavior. It is the fact that your evolution reminds them of their own stagnation. The unconscious resists anything that threatens its familiar patterns. Even unhealthy patterns feel safer than unfamiliar freedom. Imagine a prisoner who has lived inside one room for decades. The door suddenly opens, freedom is available. Yet instead of leaving, he remains inside. Not because freedom is undesirable, but because the unknown feels terrifying. Many people unconsciously choose emotional prisons for exactly this reason. The familiar pain feels safer than uncertain growth. When someone close to them begins walking toward freedom, it awakens anxiety. Rather than confronting that anxiety, they attempt to pull the other person back, not through obvious force, but through guilt, criticism, manipulation, or emotional obligation.
One of the most common forms of unconscious manipulation is guilt.
Guilt is remarkably powerful because compassionate individuals naturally dislike disappointing others. The manipulator understands this, even if only unconsciously. Instead of directly asking for control, they create emotional pressure. "If you loved me, If you cared, if you hadn't changed, if you were the person you used to be. Notice how these statements quietly shift responsibility. Your freedom becomes portrayed as betrayal. Your boundaries become interpreted as rejection. Your individuality becomes mistaken for selfishness. If you do not recognize this pattern, you slowly abandon yourself simply to preserve temporary peace. But peace purchased through self-betrayal is never real peace. It is only delayed conflict. Eventually, the soul demands honesty, and honesty always asks a difficult question. Who am I becoming by continually ignoring myself? This question frightened many of my patients, because they discovered they had spent years becoming versions of themselves designed entirely around pleasing others. They had learned which opinions were acceptable, which emotions were allowed, which dreams should remain hidden, which parts of themselves needed to disappear in order to maintain relationships. Piece by piece, they sacrificed authenticity until one day they no longer recognized the person staring back from the mirror. This is one reason the shadow becomes so powerful. Every authentic impulse you suppress does not vanish, it enters the unconscious. Every truth you refuse to speak, every boundary you fail to establish, every dream you postpone, every emotion you deny becomes part of the shadow. And the shadow never disappears. It waits patiently until consciousness is ready to acknowledge it. Many people imagine the shadow consists only of anger, violence, or destructive impulses, but this is only half the story. Your shadow also contains your neglected confidence, your hidden creativity, your courage, your independence, your ability to say no, your capacity to walk away from unhealthy relationships, your authentic voice. When these qualities remain unconscious, you become vulnerable to people who unconsciously feed upon your silence. The person who cannot say no becomes surrounded by endless demands. The person afraid of conflict attracts those who create it. The person desperate for approval becomes easily manipulated by criticism. Life always reveals what remains unconscious, not to punish you, but to awaken you. The moment you reclaim these forgotten parts of yourself, something extraordinary begins to happen. The people who once drained your energy no longer affect you in the same way. Not because they disappeared, because the version of you they depended upon no longer exists. You are no longer trying to rescue everyone, no longer trying to earn love through exhaustion, no longer confusing sacrifice with virtue. Instead, you begin offering your light from abundance rather than obligation, and there is an enormous difference. A candle freely shared continues burning. A candle forced to burn for everyone eventually melts away. Your soul was never created to disappear so others could remain comfortable. It was created to become fully alive. There is an emotion that hides behind polite smiles, false compliments, and quiet conversations. Few people recognize it, because unlike anger, it rarely announces itself. It waits in silence, it watches, it compares, and eventually it begins searching for a way to reduce the light that reminds it of its own darkness. That emotion is envy. Most people imagine envy as wanting another person's possessions, a larger home, more money, greater success. But psychological envy is far more subtle. Often, people do not envy what you own. They envy who you have become, your peace, your confidence, your discipline, your authenticity, your ability to remain calm when life becomes difficult. These qualities silently confront something painful within them, because every encounter with genuine inner strength reminds the unconscious of the strength it has neglected within itself. The unconscious dislikes this discomfort. Rather than asking, "How can I grow?" it often asks, "How can I make them smaller?" Not consciously, rarely with deliberate cruelty, but through countless subtle behaviors. A sarcastic remark disguised as humor, a compliment followed immediately by criticism, silence when you succeed, excitement when you fail. Notice these patterns carefully. People reveal their hearts less through what they celebrate, and more through what they cannot celebrate. Observe who becomes genuinely happy when life blesses you. Observe who quietly withdraws, who changes the subject, who minimizes your achievement, who suddenly reminds you of your flaws. These reactions speak a language deeper than words. They belong to the unconscious. One of the greatest mistakes compassionate people make is believing everyone wants to see them flourish. This belief feels comforting, but it is not always true. Many individuals support your dreams only until those dreams begin surpassing their expectations. As long as your light remains small, it feels safe, predictable, comfortable. But the moment your light begins illuminating possibilities they have avoided, your existence quietly challenges them. Without speaking a word, you become evidence that change is possible, and evidence is difficult to ignore. Imagine two seeds planted beside one another. One chooses to grow, the other remains buried. As the first reaches toward the sun, the second remains in darkness. Soon, the growing tree begins casting light upon what the buried seed refused to become. The tree did nothing wrong. Its existence alone became confrontation. Life often functions in this exact way. Your growth becomes uncomfortable for those committed to remaining unchanged. This is why individuation is not merely a personal journey. It transforms every relationship around you. Some people will be inspired. Others will become defensive. Some will celebrate your evolution. Others will unconsciously attempt to interrupt it. Not because they hate you, because your transformation exposes the excuses they continue believing. This is projection. Projection is among the most fascinating phenomena I ever observed. The human mind continually attributes its own hidden qualities to other people. The dishonest person becomes suspicious of everyone. The arrogant person constantly accuses others of pride. The manipulative person assumes manipulation everywhere. The insecure person imagines endless judgment. People rarely see the world as it is. They see the world through themselves. This realization changes how you interpret criticism. When someone speaks, listen carefully. Sometimes they describe you. Often, they unknowingly describe themselves. A person consumed by bitterness usually discovers bitterness everywhere. Someone living in fear constantly predicts disaster. Someone filled with shame assumes rejection before acceptance. The outer world becomes a canvas upon which the unconscious paints itself. Understanding this prevents countless unnecessary conflicts. Because you stop accepting every opinion as objective truth, you begin asking, does this belong to me or to them? This single question protects enormous amounts of emotional energy. Not every accusation deserves your defense. Not every misunderstanding requires explanation. Not every opinion deserves residence inside your mind. One of the greatest freedoms a person can discover is realizing they are not responsible for correcting every false perception. Imagine standing before a lake. Someone throws mud into the water. Would you climb inside, attempting to remove every grain? Of course not. You wait. The water settles naturally. Clarity returns on its own. Human conflict often works the same way. The more desperately you attempt to defend yourself against every misunderstanding, the more exhausted you become. Truth possesses remarkable patience. It rarely needs constant explanation. This is why emotionally mature individuals often appear surprisingly calm during criticism. Not because criticism never affects them, but because they understand something the ego forgets. Every reaction strengthens the emotional bond. Every unnecessary argument creates another invisible chain. Silence, when chosen consciously, can become extraordinary strength. There are moments when words illuminate. There are also moments when words only feed confusion. Wisdom lies in recognizing the difference. Many people desperately seek the final sentence that will make everyone understand them. Such a sentence does not exist. Some people have already decided who you are. No amount of explanation changes a mind committed to misunderstanding you. Accepting this truth is strangely liberating. You stop performing. You stop proving. You stop exhausting yourself chasing universal approval. Instead, you quietly become more authentic. There is another force that quietly feeds upon your light. Comparison. Modern society encourages endless comparison. Who earns more? Who looks better? Who receives greater admiration? Who appears happier? Comparison creates a life where your eyes remain fixed upon everyone except yourself. The tragedy is not that comparison makes you jealous. The tragedy is that it blinds you to your own path. Every soul possesses its own rhythm, its own purpose, its own season. A tree does not envy the river. The moon does not compete with the sun. Nature never compares. Only the unconscious ego believes value must be measured against someone else. The moment you release comparison, something beautiful happens. Your energy returns, because it is no longer leaking into lives you were never meant to live. You become fully present within your own journey. And presence is where authentic power begins. The people who once unsettled you begin losing their influence, not because they changed, but because your attention no longer feeds the emotional patterns they unconsciously depended upon. You finally understand that your greatest responsibility is not convincing others to appreciate your light. It is refusing to abandon it. Because every time you dim yourself to satisfy another person's insecurity, the world loses a version of you it desperately needed. Your light was never meant to become smaller so that others could remain comfortable. It was meant to illuminate the path for those courageous enough to discover their own. There comes a moment in every life when you begin noticing something that once escaped your attention. The people around you have not changed. The world has not become darker. Human nature has remained remarkably consistent throughout history. What has changed is your awareness. And awareness is both a gift and a burden. Because once you truly begin seeing unconscious patterns, you cannot pretend they do not exist. You notice conversations that revolve entirely around negativity. You notice friendships built upon dependency instead of mutual growth. You notice how certain people become energized by conflict rather than peace. You notice how others seek constant attention because they have never learned to sit quietly with themselves. Most importantly, you notice how often you have abandoned yourself simply to keep everyone else comfortable. This realization is painful. But every genuine awakening begins with discomfort. The ego prefers comfortable illusions. The soul prefers difficult truths. For many years, people asked me, how do I protect myself from those who drain my energy? They expected techniques, rules, strategies, perhaps even psychological defenses. But my answer was always deeper than they anticipated. The greatest protection is not building higher walls. It is becoming so deeply rooted within yourself that manipulation no longer finds fertile ground. Think about a magnificent oak tree. It does not argue with the wind. It does not chase every falling leaf. It does not fear each passing storm. Its strength comes from its roots, not its resistance. Likewise, your psychological strength does not come from controlling people. It comes from knowing yourself so completely that no one else's confusion becomes your identity. This is why the journey toward individuation is essential. Individuation is not becoming perfect, it is becoming whole. Most people spend their lives trying to become the version of themselves they believe the world will accept. They hide their fears, suppress their anger, silence their intuition, ignore their dreams. They wear masks for so long that eventually they forget there was ever a face beneath them. The tragedy is not merely living behind a mask. The tragedy is believing the mask is who you are. Your authentic self has never disappeared. It has simply waited, patiently, quietly, beneath years of expectations, beneath years of pleasing others, beneath years of pretending to be someone easier to love. The light you believe others have taken from you was never completely lost. It was buried, covered by fear, covered by guilt, covered by endless compromises. But buried light is still light. It only waits for courage. Many people hope one day they will wake up feeling completely confident, fearless, untouchable. That day rarely arrives by accident. Confidence is not discovered, it is built, one truthful decision at a time. Every time you say no when your soul means no, your light grows stronger. Every time you stop apologizing for existing, your light grows brighter. Every time you refuse to betray your values simply to gain approval, another piece of yourself returns home. This is how psychological power develops. Not through domination, not through superiority, but through integrity. Integrity means your inner life and outer life no longer contradict one another. What you believe, what you say, and how you live become one. Such people possess a quiet strength that cannot be manufactured. They rarely need to convince anyone of their worth. They rarely seek attention, because attention is no substitute for inner peace. There is something extraordinary about a person who no longer needs constant validation. Their silence becomes powerful. Their presence becomes calming. Their words become intentional. They stop reacting to every opinion because they understand a profound truth. Not every voice deserves access to your inner sanctuary. Imagine your mind as a sacred garden. Would you allow anyone to walk inside carrying poison? Of course not. Yet countless people allow destructive opinions, constant criticism, endless negativity to occupy their thoughts every single day. Guard your mind with the same care a gardener protects fertile soil. Whatever enters repeatedly eventually grows. Feed your mind resentment, and resentment becomes your personality. Feed it fear, and fear becomes your future. Feed it wisdom, reflection, purpose, and compassion. Those qualities slowly become your nature. The unconscious is always listening. Be careful what you repeatedly tell yourself. Many people have spent years saying, "I'm not enough. Nobody understands me. I'll never change." The unconscious accepts repetition as truth. Eventually, these beliefs become invisible prisons. But the opposite is also true. Every day you choose awareness over reaction, presence over impulse, truth over approval. You reshape the architecture of your own mind. Transformation is never sudden. It is the result of thousands of quiet choices that no one else sees. One day, people will say, "You seem different." And they will be right. Not because you became someone new, because you finally stopped abandoning the person you always were. There is one final lesson I wish to leave with you. Do not spend your life searching for people who will never misunderstand you. They do not exist. Do not waste your years trying to convince everyone to appreciate your heart. Some people are simply unable to recognize what they have never cultivated within themselves. Instead, become the kind of person whose peace no longer depends upon recognition, whose kindness no longer depends upon gratitude, whose confidence no longer depends upon applause, whose purpose no longer depends upon permission. When you reach this place, something beautiful happens. You stop asking, "Who is feeding on my light?" Because you discover a light that cannot be stolen. It may be ignored, it may be criticized, it may even be envied, but it cannot be extinguished, not by rejection, not by betrayal, not by misunderstanding, because it no longer comes from other people. It comes from the deepest center of your being, the place where the self quietly waits beneath every fear, every mask, every wound, every expectation. Return to that place often. Protect it, honor it, listen to it. For the world will always contain those who seek energy they have never learned to create within themselves. Do not hate them, do not fear them. Simply refuse to surrender the light that was entrusted to you. Lead with compassion, walk with discernment, love without losing yourself, give without emptying yourself, forgive without abandoning your boundaries, and remember, your greatest responsibility is not to save every wandering soul. It is to remain faithful to your own. Because when one person becomes fully conscious, they give silent permission for others to begin awakening as well. Perhaps that is how darkness has always been overcome, not by fighting it endlessly, but by becoming so completely alive. that your very existence reminds others of the light they have forgotten within themselves. And perhaps that is the real purpose of your journey. Not merely to survive the darkness, but to become the light the darkness can never consume. Thank you for listening. Until our next exploration of the human psyche, remember this: the brightest light is not the one that shines for everyone, but the one that never abandons itself, even in the deepest darkness.